Alright, you guys, long time no see. We are about halfway through the European clay court swing ahead of Roland Garros. As you guys will know, we crowned champions Carlos Alcaraz in Monte Carlo and Holger Rune in Barcelona. And now, drawing closer and closer to the second half, actually, Madrid has actually technically already started. Another one of the 2-week Masters, really all of them now, except for Monte Carlo and the Paris indoors. But with the dawn of Madrid also comes the, upcoming return of world number one Jannik Sinner, as well as a little bit of a reconvening of the tour, at least the top of it. Novak Djokovic, of course, after looking so good in Miami, really tamely bowing out in Monte Carlo. Taylor Fritz as well suffered with injury with the abdomen, really going back to February, but that kept him out after Miami looks to return. Alexander Zverev, who, it had been a rough go of it for him really since the Australian Open final and beyond. A homecoming in Munich seemed to stem the tide for him again. And well, for the rest, as has been for pretty much the entirety of this season, something that's been a prevailing theme throughout the men's tennis season, at least this year, which has been that I've never seen a top 10 for whatever reason. Some of them being legitimate injury concerns, age in the case of a Novak Djokovic, etc., etc. But I've never seen a top 10 collectively just perform so mid. And of course, the one player of the mix that, going on a year plus has been, the consistent fixture at the back end of tournaments, Jannik Sinner. He has missed everything since the Australian Open, of course, serving the suspension that came with his whole doping fiasco with WADA. And as a result, right now, if you're on the outside looking in, it really doesn't matter, how far down the rankings. We've seen, a Jack Draper, if you're going to have, a great start to the season, a great first third of the year, you get your first big title, and you are ranked just outside the top 5 right now. Arthur Fils, as he continues to get better, seemingly by the week, and has been, under the radar, super consistent for a couple of months now. He's knocking on the door. Lorenzo Musetti, he's continued his upward trajectory since last summer in that loss to Djokovic at Roland Garros. And even though he got injured in that finals run to Monte Carlo, if he can get back to what he's been, it's a great time to make, a real push to get into that top 10. Same for Ben Shelton, off to the best start to a season in his young career to this point. Of course, Jakob Mensik, since the last time I made a video, ended up putting together a flawless 2 weeks of tennis in Miami. We're still yet to see how he acclimates to clay, grass, the natural surfaces, but by putting together that run where everything clicked, and even though it would be unlikely, honestly, for him to be firing on all cylinders like that consistently, even for someone like him ranked, I think, near the world number 20 spot, it's not that far-fetched for him to, put together a couple more good results and be knocking on the door there as well, because a lot of the guys who we saw as fixtures in the top 10, top 8 over the last 5 or so years, as we anticipated, a lot of those next-gen guys are seemingly on the decline, or just in the midst of confidence crises, slumps, whatever the case may be. And that includes Daniil Medvedev, Stefanos Tsitsipas, of course, down to, I think, number 18 in the world now. Andrei Rublev has been slipping up all over this year, aside from a title in Doha. Casper Ruud, we are now halfway through European clay, where he was spectacular a year ago. Finals in Monte Carlo, title in Barcelona. But fast forward a year, and through those two events, he has been abysmal. Really, with the exception of an acceptable Australian Open run and a solid run to the final in Dallas. And yeah, translation is as we expected going into this year. A lot of those spots are really up for grabs. And even the ones that are more set in stone, even the top, has been quite, shaky, hit or miss this year for their standards, which certainly has been an interesting watch. There is the conversation to be had of, this probably resembles more of a norm than what we became used to with the big three, big four for the better part of 2 decades. But that's totally fine. Listen, I have enjoyed a lot of these guys being rewarded for the gains that they're making, relatively immediately seeing the results. Someone like Alex de Minaur, he could see the top 5 very soon, which is something that I wouldn't have foretold in my wildest dreams before last year. It's been such a great, steep improvement curve for him over the last year plus. And yeah, if a move is to be made right now by anybody that's waiting in the wings, now is an ideal time to do so. Guys are not 100%, guys are getting old, guys are experiencing some mental fatigue. It's pretty wild out there right now, but on a more positive note, one guy who's made significant gains this year, Rune. Last we talked about him, it was a very productive, successful Indian Wells run, and unfortunately for him, he sort of no-showed in the final in spite of a buzzsaw version of Jack Draper there in the final. For Holger's part, he definitely could have put forth better. He knew that. You saw that come pouring out in the trophy ceremony. This time, Barcelona finally gets healthy again and does one better in a run that really start to finish was utterly brilliant. And let me start by saying I really was happy to see Rune get some hardware out of a season that I would like to pat myself on the back and saying I identified pretty early. I liked what I saw out of him from the jump this season, from being Jannik Sinner's toughest match down under in Australia, pretty much having that match hang in the balance for 2.5 sets. Of course, goes to Indian Wells, and quality wins there, beating Umber, Tsitsipas, Greek Spore, who has really been playing well of late, and then Medvedev as well, before losing the final convincingly. And with his most recent triumph, actually breaking, a 2-year-long title drought pretty much, going back to Munich 2023. Long time coming, and he does it in emphatic fashion. Quarterfinals on, beats Casper Ruud, which historically has not been a great head-to-head for Holger on clay. Karen Khachanov dismantled him, a guy who can always make things tricky if you're not on your game. And then that final with Carlos Alcaraz, where a little over a set in, Alcaraz got hurt, and the wind went out of his sails pretty quickly after that. But what I will say is that I think to that point, Holger had been the better player. Won that set in a breaker on, I want to say, his 4th set point, after having chances to break for the set at 5-4. But he was never shaken, and that really was, I think, a really encouraging, I don't want to say blast from the past, because he's still so young, and it was only up until 2 years ago where he was still so brilliant early in his career against top 10, top 5, the very best in the game. And of course, it's been made a lot out of Holger being on a 13-match losing streak going into this final against top 5 opposition, and his last win being against Djokovic in Rome 2023. But yeah, in this final, that poise was, on full display. He was the one that surrendered the early break at 2-all, but never got flustered. Even with the missed chances, he was never pressing, he never panicked, and, he just looked very decisive. I think mentally, I've always thought Holger, I think he's an exceptional player in the clutch. He just has always had that clutch gene from, the moment that we became acquainted with him, in 2021, 2022. But at times, of course, there's been indecision with how he wants to play, and it does remind me a little bit of a young Dimitrov, not necessarily in the same way, but I do feel like for so long Grigor was really in two minds of how he wanted to play, between the baby Fed moniker, try to emulate Federer or utilize his athletic gifts, play into counterpunching a little bit. And Holger, it's been something he has struggled with since probably, his tremendous clay court season 2 years ago in 2023. And who knows, maybe clay just makes it easier for him, just comes more naturally for when he wants to defend, not put as much onus on himself to try to ball bash, and the court just giving him more time if he is to play more passively, not be made to pay as much with how spinny short he can play at times, particularly off his forehand when he's playing on the other extreme. But there was no such indecision seeing him in Barcelona. In fact, you saw pretty much the whole array of, his skill set. The variety was on full display, came in a lot in this final, and did it really effectively. Took advantage of the ground Alcaraz was giving up because he was standing really far back to return. And, also against Khachanov, I really noticed him making full use of the drop shot, bringing Khachanov up. Obviously not very comfortable in the forecourt. Yeah, he was the complete package, and as fun as it was to watch, of course, I'll say the same thing I said after Indian Wells, and that's, with Holger, it's hard to take any of his results and predicate future success going off any of his prior results. And of course, his record does show that he is 16-9 on the year. That won't really wow anybody, but I think it's been a very clear step forward for him. Of course, a lot of those losses also, he's dealt with injury, illness. Still, I'd probably say, of course, we have to see more to say, it's clicked for him, he's figured it out. But at the same time, I can appreciate how awesome it was to see him at his best again. And certainly a really well-earned title run. Really good to see. After a lot of good work he's done this year, he definitely deserved to have something to show for it in terms of some hardware. And it should be a lot of fun to see what's in store for him rest of this clay court season. But let's get to the other finalist, Carlos Alcaraz, announcing today he will miss the Madrid Open on account of the injury he sustained in the Barcelona final. I believe it was a right adductor, in addition to also some niggling left hamstring pain that he sustained after that final. I would hope that that doesn't sideline him beyond this tournament in particular, especially since, despite the loss in the final, he had been picking up some really good momentum. Obviously, title Monte Carlo, final Barcelona, winning a lot of matches, regardless of whether it was pretty or not, after what had been a letdown of a Sunshine Double. Before diving into the last couple weeks it's been for Carlos Alcaraz, I do want to say that this should probably be an indicator moving forward of not trying to play 4 tune-up events in the clay court season. To this point, since Carlos became a top player, 2022, he had to miss Rome, 2023. Already, He came into clay court season not 100%, so had to miss Monte Carlo and played 3 events that year. And last year, again, well documented, coming into clay court season not 100%, carrying an arm injury. Pretty much made his preparation up to Roland Garros a wash. And yeah, I think that for him, probably it would be best to keep it at 3 events tops. It's always tough to say, because I used to feel the same for Rafa at the tail end, and it is tough with them being Spaniards, and where it feels like the best route to cutting down the wear and tear in clay court season would be cutting out one of Barcelona or Madrid, just since conditions there don't mimic the rest of, European clay court season. But you almost feel obligated for those 2 events if you are the torchbearer for Spanish tennis. And also, this is a take I've sort of soft launched since the end of last year, but at this point it does feel like Alexander Zverev is really the only guy on tour that can handle the rigors of playing every single big event and more, playing a lot of 500s as well in his case. Basically being able to endure week in, week out, going deep, almost every tournament. Obviously, since Australia, that hasn't been the case for him this year, but his track record does speak to that. And I do think that is because modern tennis seems to be gearing towards a more power-centric game across the board. And I don't know, stylistically, I just think within the season, that does not loan itself to durability or sustainability. And certainly, we've heard complaints from a litany of players about the quality of the balls being used these days. That also a factor. But over the last couple of years, especially with the new generation, I have seen a lot of high-profile cases now where putting yourself through a lot of these events back-to-back, a lot of top players have sustained injuries, Carlos included, Yannick included even, last spring during clay court season. Yeah, I mean, it's just an observation, and I don't put any blame on anyone. It just is my best guess that this is sort of a stylistic thing where accumulation injuries are happening at a more accelerated rate. Doesn't seem to take as much to accumulate the stress on the body and whatnot. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting seeing a lot of younger players now having to manage their schedule in a way that in the past it seemed like you only had to start worrying about that as you got into your early mid-30s. But as for Carlos Alcaraz, I mean, I didn't think he played particularly great in Monte Carlo. I thought his best match was against Davidovich Fokina in the semis. Final, of course, was very high level for the better part of 2 sets before Musetti hit the physical wall, something that wasn't all too surprising coming off of some really physical matches with Tsitsipas and de Minaur coming into that final. Ironically enough, I actually thought Carlos was playing his most clean tennis in Barcelona. If you ask me, his best matches this clay court season so far, I would probably have said his quarter and semi of Barcelona against de Minaur and Fils, where I thought he was spectacular, particularly in the latter match with Fils, where, in Monte Carlo, their match, Carlos really competed excellently, and it was a scratchy match, I thought, from both, but a very captivating watch just by virtue of the level of athletes the two of them are, and Fils seems to be on this real surge over the last month plus. And throughout that match, it seemed like he had Alcaraz exactly where he wanted him. And on one hand, Alcaraz situationally, as I've touched upon, I don't think he's been the best this year, and even extending further back than that, particularly in the face of adversity. So it was encouraging that he didn't panic backed into a corner multiple times against Fils, and it really seemed like the confidence boost that he got out of that Monte Carlo title was manifesting itself in Barcelona. Seemed like he was only getting better and better. Of course, Holger played fantastic in the final, and being left where we are right now with his injuries, you just hope that Alcaraz can get back on court, ideally, in Rome, because even as a guy that won the title in Monte Carlo and went to the final in Barcelona, I still wouldn't say that things have clicked back into place to say, we've seen a peak Alcaraz sighting this clay court season. I think given, the state of the tour at the moment, you would probably have to have him as the favorite right now for Roland Garros, just off of those results and his pedigree on the surface, and anticipating some rust for Jannik Sinner when the world number one returns. But I don't know, strangely enough, I don't feel as confident in him as I would anticipate if you had told me his clay court season started with title Monte Carlo and final Barcelona. Before we get out of here, I actually ended up whipping up this video yesterday, and as of today, a lot of withdrawals, retirements in Madrid. Wanted to get in my 2 cents about that event, basically. I think that Zverev is a reasonably strong favorite to take out the title here. I mean, even before Arthur Fils' exit today, I thought that Zverev's return to form in Munich probably is ominous with an Alcaraz-less Madrid, and Madrid has been his best Masters venue, of course. He's been dominant in 2 victories at this event in 2018 and 2021. Another final in 2023. I think he's a heavy favorite, really barring a really well-playing Djokovic showing up to this event and making it through to the final, which, in a segue too, I think Novak has a pretty great opportunity here as well to return to a Masters final pretty soon after his last one in Miami. Even before the Alcaraz withdrawal from this tournament, this was still a really good draw for Novak. I mean, at this point, before the semifinals, the only real resistance is probably Matteo Berrettini in his path. And him getting through that is really just dependent on will he be playing well this event or not. If he is, I mean, historical precedent between the two would suggest that Berrettini's going to be running uphill in that matchup. But we'll see how that shakes out. Matteo has also been playing a whole lot better this year. I really thought the 2 matches this year, and the loss to Fritz at Miami, as well as the win against Zverev in Monte Carlo, showcased the apex top-end level of Matteo Berrettini, in a way that resembled his 2021 first half of 2022 self before all these injuries really ravaged him for the last couple of years. We'll see, how all these potential matchups, if they even end up happening in a tournament like this one, for all we know, we could get a surprise winner. But again, for anybody that sort of locks in, has a good week of tennis, it is right there for the taking for them. And speaking of which, today we also saw the flip side of the coin for 2025 Holger Rune in his 3rd retirement mid-match of the season already. Of course, he was riding high, but, durability still a concern for him. I wasn't really able to read into too much of what the injury was in his match, but hopefully it's nothing severe, especially so close to a truly signature moment for him, where things seem to be on the up and up. Of course, I also discussed Taylor Fritz, who I think was in Holger's quarter, and his return in Madrid. I think, as a guy that was a semifinalist here a year ago, he definitely can duplicate that result with ease if he is back to 100%. He is not your typical American on clay, not really your Bambi on ice. He has played well on clay, seemed to play better and better over the last couple of years. And yeah, I mean, there's always the possibility, as I said, with so many question marks next to the top guys that, someone completely off our radar could go on a run here. But yeah, I'm rolling with Zverev, and, he's so much more reliable best of 3 than best of 5, regardless of whether he's playing top flight opposition or not. And these are proven great conditions for him, so I do back him to win here. But yeah, that'll do it for this first half of clay court season recap. With Roland Garros right around the corner, with Jannik Sinner's return right around the corner, should spell for a ramp up for a lot of these guys as we near the year's second major. So looking forward to it, and if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate y'all, and of course, I will see y'all in the next one.